Hi everyone, I'm Toni Holness. I'm the Public Policy Director for the ACLU of Maryland.
And I'm Sergio España. I'm the Director of Engagement and Mobilization here at ACLU of Maryland.
We're going to be talking with you about our legislative priorities for the 2018 legislative session, which is only a day away.
Less than 24 hours.
So Sergio is going to kick us off, but before we start, we just want to let you know that, of course, the ACLU of Maryland works on a broad range of civil rights and civil liberties issues. So the issues we're discussing with you today is certainly not inclusive of everything, but these are sort of the highlights of the issues we expect to spend the most time and energy and resources on this session.
Yes. That's not at all to say that they're the most important. But with that said, we have quite a bit to cover, and so we want to share the information with you. Our first one is actually going to be focused on Election Day registration. So as everyone who's listening right now knows, the ability and, dare I say, responsibility to vote is probably one of the most important acts that we're able to engage in as American citizens. And despite over a century of struggle, civil rights movements, very significant wins to ensure we can increase the access to vote for all American citizens, over the last several years, it's been pretty disturbing. We've seen a lot of backtracking, a lot of efforts to actually try to undermine people's access to vote. In particular, we're seeing efforts that are trying to undermine access to vote for folks who are struggling with poverty and minorities and people of color. So here in Maryland, we're actually very excited. We have a very strong coalition and a lot of support, bipartisan support in Annapolis to actually be, not just be on the defensive, but actually help to further increase access for folks to have the right to vote. So we're actually going to be introducing legislation for Election Day registration. That's basically the same day registration that's been implemented in about 15 states already, including our nation's capital. It's important to note that this is nothing new. I think the first time that it was put in place was in the 1970s. And so we have a real strong track record of what this looks like in action, how to make sure that we're making sure that eligible citizens are registered to vote, and that it can also be done very quickly. And in Maryland, actually, we're one of the 15 states. We have same-day registration for early voting, so we know exactly what needs to happen to make sure that we responsibly are registering folks to vote on Election Day. And we just think it's incredibly important that we see this through. So we're part of a coalition called Everyone Votes Maryland that's working in partnership with Legal Women Voters Maryland, Common Cause, Maryland State Education Association, Talbot County Rising, SEIU, Maryland Working Families, and several other very committed individuals and organizations across the state to see this through. We think that obviously our right to vote is also our responsibility, but us having the ability to vote, making sure that voting is easy, that anyone can vote, that we think is the responsibility of government institutions. So we want to make sure that this goes through, and what would happen is it'll be actually turned into a ballot initiative after it makes its way through the session, so that hopefully by the end of this year we'll be able to vote it into law when we go in on Election Day. And basically that way, folks who are working 2 or 3 jobs that are providing for their families and are not sure if they can make it, aren't entirely sure where they are with the registration, can still go on Election Day and make sure that their voice and their votes counted. So we're pretty excited for that.
Thank you, Sergio. The other issue I'll talk with you about is bail reform. In Maryland, in 2016, the Court of Appeals issued a new rule saying 3 things on the use of bail in Maryland. The first thing the court said was that bail should not be used for public safety reasons. It should only be used to guarantee someone's reappearance in court for their court date. And that makes sense because paying a certain dollar amount does not make somebody more safe than they were before they paid that amount. And also, if somebody is not a public safety threat, there's no reason that failure to or their inability to pay a dollar amount should keep them detained. The second thing that the court rule said was that the courts should not be using bail reflexively. It should not be the first option. We should look at other conditions of release, treatment, substance use disorder treatment, mental health treatment, things like that, supports that folks need to stay out of trouble and show up for their court date. Those are the kinds of conditions of release that courts should be looking at before they rely on cash bail. The third thing the court said was that the court may not set bail in an amount that it knows the defendant cannot afford. So bail should not be unaffordable in Maryland. So this rule was taken up by the Court of Appeals in 2016 and actually was enacted in February 2017 during the last legislative session. As you probably know, we also saw an onslaught of legislation that sought to undo these, what we thought were really forward-thinking and progressive policies. We fully expect that in the 2018 session, we may see similar regressive legislation introduced. And so we're working with our partners in the Campaign for a Safe and Just Maryland to work defensively against any bad regressive legislation. The other thing that we want folks to know is, there are three things that we think the court really needs to be fully implemented. First is there are not pretrial services in every jurisdiction. And pretrial services are sort of like parole and probation services, but on the front end before your trial date. And we think the jurisdictions that have pretrial services probably use some improvement. But for certainly those jurisdictions that have no pretrial services ought to start implementing some. We also need to continue collecting data so that we can be evidence-based and data-informed in our policy decisions about pretrial. The third thing is we want to make sure that jurisdictions are being totally transparent and democratic in how they are adopting policies and tools, especially risk assessment tools, which are sort of algorithms to decide who's released and who is not released. When jurisdictions are making those kinds of decisions, the communities who are subject to these policies and these risk assessment tools ought to be able to have some control and say in what the jurisdiction actually finally adopts. So that's where we're heading on bail reform. The other issue that's criminal justice related is solitary confinement. Maryland uses solitary confinement at about twice the national average. Nationally, about 4 to 5% of prisoners are put in solitary confinement on a single day. In Maryland, about 8% of our state prisoners are put in solitary confinement. The length of stay is also very troubling. According to the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, folks should not be put in solitary confinement for more than 15 days, 15 consecutive days. But here in Maryland, folks are spending on average 128 days in solitary confinement. And if you think that's bad, it's even worse for prisoners with serious mental illness. They are put in solitary confinement at even double the general population. So even more than the 8%, about 15% of those folks are put in solitary confinement, and they're there for longer, on average 228 days. This is a really counterproductive policy. What we know is that solitary confinement has serious deleterious effects on folks' mental health. And, for all it's worth, when folks go into our prisons, there ought to be some corrective aspect. And unfortunately, what we're seeing with this practice of solitary confinement is that folks are predisposed to be released, and over 95% of folks are eventually released in worse condition than they were in. And at that point, it presents a real public safety risk for our communities because we are not equipping folks with the tools that they need to re-enter society in an effective way. So this year, we'll be working on legislation to limit the use of solitary confinement in Maryland. And so I'll turn to Sergio.
Yeah, thanks. And actually, those two examples that you raised really make it clear just how important it is that we actually have data. Because when you're pointing out our numbers here in for folks who are dealing with solitary confinement, you're able to see just not only how dangerous it is for our community, but also just how grossly unequal it is.
Mm-hmm.
And so we want to figure out how to continue to push that in terms of increasing our access to data. So we're also going to be working on introducing legislation to strengthen how we're tracking race in terms of criminal justice reporting. So currently, we know that basically the vast majority of criminal justice reporting in Maryland basically breaks us down into two categories: black or white. That's despite the fact that 16% of us are either Latino or Asian, and we're actually, I think, the fourth most diverse country in the state. So we know that that's just grossly inadequate. Along with that, it's also very problematic because we're seeing is that overwhelmingly, particularly Latinos and other people of color, are being categorized as white, which helps to hide and distort the actual true racial disparities that we're seeing in criminal justice enforcement. So what we're going to do this session is we're going to be introducing legislation that will create a task force. This is a task force that will be composed of folks from state agencies, local law enforcement, local government, advocates, community leaders, and basically provide them with the tools and the responsibility to come up with recommendations on how to most effectively and responsibly track data in criminal justice reporting, and what are the kind of procedures that law enforcement would have to engage in to do that in a way that would not be, that would actually be productive, and we would be asking necessarily more of their time, but very, very crucially will allow us as a state and as residents here to understand just where those disparities are in terms of criminal justice and law enforcement, so we can see what if any issues there are that should be addressed. So we're very much looking forward to that as well. It might sound kind of boring in terms of its data or whatnot, but it's actually critically important. So we definitely encourage y'all to track that as well.
Thank you for joining us. If you have any questions or you want more information about the work that we are doing this legislative session, there should be an email address popping up on your screen, so feel free to reach out.
Yep, so it's ACLU at ACLU-Maryland.org. So, sorry, ACLU at ACLU-MD.org. I wonder what that stands for. And yeah, definitely encourage y'all to email us if you want more information, and also if you want to plug in. So we have literally tens of thousands of members across the state that are engaging in these issues, raising awareness about how so many of these issues that we're going to be introducing and working on in Annapolis directly affect them and their families, and making sure that the voices are heard both in Annapolis and locally. So if you want to make sure that your voice is included as well, please just shoot us an email and we'll plug you in. Thanks so much.
Thank you.